it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Sher, who's a distinguished professor at the Department of History at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. So it is an honor to have you with us for the annual conference of the Canadian Society for 18th Century Studies in Montreal. Not only is this conference in association with the 18th Century Scottish Studies Society, but its broader theme also happens to be revolutions in 18th century sociability. This seems like a great opportunity to hear from a distinguished scholar such as you, who has worked on booksellers and authors' relations in 18th century Scotland. What can you tell us about the importance of sociability in the Scottish Enlightenment?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the research group in the history of sociability is an exciting occurrence, and I'm glad to be a part of what's happening. I think sociability is at the core of the Scottish Enlightenment, and it's really essential to what happened in the 18th century in Scotland. I could perhaps talk a little bit about how my work started in relation to this theme, because when I started out many years ago, several decades ago, put it that way, the interest in the Scottish Enlightenment was growing quite a lot, but it was almost wholly confined to the history of thought and the history of ideas. So there was a great deal of interest in David Hume and his thought, and Adam Smith and his thought, and various other thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment as thinkers. But there wasn't very much done yet about the context in which that thought took place. So when I began my work, I began looking at the way that the Scottish Enlightenment was situated contextually, and particularly the institutional arrangements and the relationships between the different thinkers, or literati as they sometimes called themselves and have been called ever since. And in my first book, which came out of my postgraduate work, called the Church, University, and Enlightenment, I looked at a group of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, William Robertson and some other thinkers of his group, who were all Presbyterian ministers and also men of letters, and who worked together in various ways to make Scotland into a place that was more receptive to Enlightenment ideas. And in this first book, I tried to see how groups interacted, and sociability was certainly a part of what was going on. William Robertson and his circle changed the Kirk of Scotland, the Church of Scotland, from a somewhat intolerant institution to an enlightened institution. And I think that contrasts very vividly with, for example, what was happening in France at the same time, where the French Enlightenment was, to put it mildly, not assisted by the church very much, and often persecuted by the church. The same with the universities, which were generally not supportive of the Enlightenment in France, but after Robertson and his group, the moderate literati of Edinburgh, as I call them, because they were part of a moderate party, after they came to power in the church and also established themselves in the University of Edinburgh, the environment in Scotland became one that was quite conducive to Enlightenment thinkers and enlightened ideas. And a good example of that is David Hume, who was somewhat radical in his thought, somewhat unusual outside the mainstream, let's say, in his thinking about religion in particular, but was able to thrive in Scotland in the latter part of his life, largely because of the William Robertson circle of moderate literati. So I started from there, and in that work I began to see how the relationships of men of letters, they are mostly men, there are not a lot of women involved at this time, but how these men of letters began to interact in different ways. And this included not just the church and the university, but also sociable institutions such as clubs and societies. And these were of various kinds. There were intellectual societies, that thrived in the Scottish Enlightenment, and there were convivial ones, and also there were some that were dedicated to certain kinds of causes. And all of them, in one way or another, were sociable, were opportunities for people to get together and exchange ideas. In the more intellectual clubs, I guess you could call them, such as the Philosophical Society of Edinburgh and the Aberdeen Philosophical Society and the Glasgow Literary Society, the atmosphere was a little more formal. It was sociability, but it was sociability mediated through a somewhat academic environment in which thinkers, intellectuals got together and exchanged ideas, gave formal papers, perhaps, in these societies, and critiqued each other. And then there were other clubs where it was not so formal, not so intellectual in nature. And an example of one would be the Poker Club in Edinburgh, which was designed to be a club dedicated to a particular cause, the cause of a Scottish militia, and which thrived among the same literati who I've been speaking about. And then I went on in my own work to begin to consider how there was an important dimension which had not been studied very much in regard to the thought of the Scottish Enlightenment, and that was the book trade and the way that books were used to advance ideas. And it occurred to me that in order for the great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment to get their ideas into print, there had to be a connection with the book trade. And I then went on to write about that in a book that is dedicated to the way that the Scottish literati published their books and the way that a network of booksellers interacted with the literati in ways that were often quite sociable and sometimes involving personal relationships and even hospitality, such as Boswell's publishers, the Dilly brothers, showed to him.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sher, for your time and for your wonderful insights.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.